Welcome back to True Crime After Dark, where we dive into the darkest corners of the human mind. This is part 1 of the Jeffrey Epstein saga. Tonight's story is not just about crime. It is about power, corruption, and secrecy on a global scale. It is about a man who rose from a modest background in Brooklyn to become a figure whose name now represents one of the greatest scandals of our time. A man who built a world of wealth and luxury that masked a darker reality, one of manipulation, SA, and silence. This is the story of Jeffrey Epstein. For decades, Epstein moved among the most powerful people in the world. Presidents, royalty, billionaires, celebrities, and renowned scientists. He lived in mansions, flew on private jets, and owned a private island. He cultivated an image of exclusivity, presenting himself as a financial genius, a philanthropist, and a man whose Rolodex included names others could only dream of meeting. But beneath the surface, a much darker system was in place. Survivors later revealed how Epstein lured young women with promises of modeling jobs, scholarships, or financial support. They spoke of his closest confidant, Ghislaine Maxwell, who sometimes pulled her car over in New York to approach unsuspecting girls, striking up conversations that seemed casual, only to lead them into Epstein's world. What made this case especially shocking was not only the crimes themselves, but the way Epstein was shielded. In 2008, despite overwhelming evidence and dozens of survivors, Epstein struck a plea deal that gave him what many call a sweetheart sentence. He served just over a year, much of it on work release. Justice was denied and the survivors were silenced. But years later, journalists, survivors, and investigators brought the case back into the light. In 2019, Epstein was arrested again, charged federally with crimes that could finally hold him accountable. But just weeks later, he was found dead in his jail cell, authorities saying he had unalived himself. The suspicious circumstances, malfunctioning cameras, sleeping guards, and prior incidents fueled a storm of conspiracy theories that rage to this day. And in the end, with Epstein gone, the world turned to Maxwell. She was arrested, tried, and convicted for her role in his system of exploitation. Survivors at last had some measure of justice, though questions still remain about how far Epstein's network reached, and who else may have been complicit. Tonight, we will take you through Epstein's story in full, from his beginnings in Brooklyn, to the mansions, the island, the plea deals, the arrest, the unaliving, and the aftermath. Along the way, we will hear the voices of survivors, understand the systemic failures that allowed him to operate, and confront the uncomfortable truth about how power can shield predators from justice. So settle in. This is going to be a long and disturbing journey, but it is one that demands to be told. Because the survivors deserve to be heard, and the world must never forget. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. At first glance, his beginnings were unremarkable. He came from a modest, working-class Jewish family. His father, Seymour, worked as a groundskeeper and maintenance worker for the New York City Parks Department. His mother, Pauline, worked as a school aide. They lived in the seaside neighborhood of Coney Island, far removed from the opulence and power Epstein would one day surround himself with. The family lived in a modest apartment complex, where neighbors later described them as quiet but hardworking. Epstein and his younger brother, Mark, grew up in a tight-knit, immigrant-rooted community where money was always limited, but ambition ran strong. As a child, Jeffrey showed signs of both brilliance and manipulation. Teachers noticed his sharp intellect, especially in mathematics and science. He could solve complex problems quickly, often impressing his instructors. But alongside his intelligence, there were hints of arrogance. Epstein didn't always follow rules, and he seemed to thrive on bending them to his will. At Lafayette High School, Epstein continued to stand out. He played piano, loved showing off, and had a magnetic presence that drew others to him. He wasn't necessarily the most disciplined student. He skipped classes and sometimes clashed with authority, but his natural charm and quick wit helped him get by. He graduated in 1969, and like many young men from Brooklyn, his path forward wasn't entirely clear. He enrolled first at Cooper Union, a college in Manhattan, before later attending New York University's Current Institute of Mathematical Sciences. But true to form, Epstein did not finish. He dropped out without earning a degree. This lack of credentials would have held back most people. But Epstein wasn't most people. What he lacked in formal education, he made up for in charisma and audacity. He had a talent for convincing people he was more important, more connected, and more intelligent than he really was. It was a skill that would define his entire life. By his early 20s, Epstein was adrift. Intelligent but unproven, ambitious but without a clear path. Yet fate, connections, and his uncanny ability to charm authority figures would soon open a door that should never have been opened. A teaching position at one of the most prestigious private schools in the country. In 1974, Jeffrey Epstein secured a job that would change the course of his life. Not because of the paycheck, but because of the people it put him in contact with. Despite having no college degree, Epstein was hired to teach math and physics at the Dalton School, one of the most prestigious private schools in Manhattan. Dalton wasn't just any school. It catered to the children of New York's elite, families with money, influence, and power. Politicians, executives, and financiers sent their children there. And somehow, a young man from Coney Island with no degree found himself standing at the front of those classrooms. How Epstein landed this position remains a mystery. Some suggest his quick intelligence and persuasive personality impressed the school's headmaster. Others believe it was another example of Epstein's gift for convincing people he was more qualified than he really was. Regardless, the fact is this: Dalton gave him access to families who lived in a world he had only dreamed of. Epstein's time as a teacher was brief, but pivotal. Students later described him as unusual, charismatic, but also cocky. He dressed sharply, spoke confidently, and carried himself more like a businessman than a teacher. His arrogance rubbed some the wrong way, but others saw potential in him. One of the parents he encountered during his tenure at Dalton was Alan Ace Greenberg, then the CEO of Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most powerful investment banks. Greenberg took a liking to Epstein, impressed by his intelligence and confidence. In 1976, Greenberg offered him a job at Bear Stearns. This was Epstein's ticket out of the classroom and into the world of high finance. At Bear Stearns, Epstein quickly made a name for himself. He specialized in advising wealthy clients on tax strategies and complex investments. He didn't climb the corporate ladder in the traditional way. He didn't have an Ivy League degree, nor a long resume of prior accomplishments. What he had was nerve, charm, and the ability to win people over. Co-workers later remembered him as brilliant but unorthodox. He had a knack for solving problems others couldn't, and he wasn't afraid to bend the rules. In the cutthroat world of Wall Street, those qualities set him apart. By the early 1980s, however, Epstein left Bear Stearns under mysterious circumstances. Reports differ on why. Some say he was caught up in a policy violation involving an insider trading investigation. Others say he simply wanted more independence. Whatever the truth, Epstein left with something far more valuable than his job: connections to wealthy clients and the confidence to strike out on his own. In 1982, Jeffrey Epstein founded his own financial management firm, J. Epstein and Company. From the beginning, he branded it as something exclusive. He claimed he only took on clients worth $1 billion or more. This aura of selectiveness gave him an air of mystique, one that appealed deeply to the wealthy, who are often drawn to what seems unattainable. His firm promised privacy, tax shelters, and financial strategies that only he could provide. Whether Epstein was truly a financial genius remains debatable. Some believe his skills were exaggerated and that much of his fortune came from leveraging relationships rather than raw talent. But in the world of high finance, perception can be more powerful than reality, and soon, that perception would land him the most important client of his career: Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands. When Jeffrey Epstein founded J. Epstein and Company in 1982, he was entering a world dominated by Ivy League pedigrees and old money names. He had neither. What he did have was ambition, charm, and a growing list of wealthy contacts. From the start, Epstein crafted his firm's identity around exclusivity. He claimed he would only take on clients worth $1 billion or more. Whether this was true or simply marketing spin, it created an image of mystery and power. To the ultra-wealthy, exclusivity often acts as bait, and Epstein knew it. His work focused on complex financial strategies, asset protection, and tax minimization. He promised absolute discretion and made himself indispensable to those who hired him. But the full details of how Epstein made his fortune remain cloudy to this day. Unlike other financiers, he never took his company public, never published records, and never revealed his full client list. That secrecy only deepened the intrigue around him. What is known is that Epstein landed one client who would change everything: Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of The Limited, which would later grow into L Brands, the empire behind Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, Bath & Body Works, and more. Epstein became Wexner's most trusted advisor. Over time, Wexner granted him power of attorney, an extraordinary legal authority that allowed Epstein to sign checks, purchase properties, and even borrow money on Wexner's behalf. It was an almost unheard-of level of trust. Through Wexner's fortune, Epstein's wealth skyrocketed. He acquired properties that would become infamous. A 7-story townhouse on East 71st Street in Manhattan, one of the largest private homes in the city, worth tens of millions. A sprawling Palm Beach estate, a mansion where many survivors later described being lured and exploited. A private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Little St. James, where Epstein would fly in associates, celebrities, and, tragically, survivors. A New Mexico ranch, vast and isolated, another stage for his manipulation system. A luxury Paris apartment and other holdings that gave him a global footprint. Each property became both a status symbol and a setting for what would later come to light as his network of control. Epstein's image as a financial genius grew. He surrounded himself with academics, scientists, politicians, and celebrities. He hosted dinners where Nobel Prize winners rubbed shoulders with presidents and royals. He funded research, donated to universities, and built a reputation as a philanthropist interested in the future of science and technology. But beneath the glittering surface, troubling whispers circulated. Staff, neighbors, and even some guests noticed the steady presence of much younger women around Epstein. Some looked barely out of high school. His explanations varied. Sometimes they were assistants, other times students or models. Few asked questions. Those who did often found themselves brushed off or shut out. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Epstein had constructed not just a financial empire, but a social one. He wasn't just wealthy, he was connected. He cultivated ties with everyone from Wall Street titans to members of British royalty. For Epstein, money was a tool, but influence was the ultimate currency. And at the heart of his empire was Ghislaine Maxwell, who entered his world in the early 1990s and became his closest confidant, companion, and, as many survivors later testified, the enabler of his crimes. Of all the wealthy clients Jeffrey Epstein courted, none shaped his empire more than Leslie Wexner. Wexner wasn't just another billionaire. By the 1980s, he had already built The Limited, a retail powerhouse that dominated American malls. His company would later expand into L Brands, the parent company of giants like Victoria's Secret, Abercrombie & Fitch, and Bath & Body Works. Epstein met Wexner in the late 1980s, and soon after, their relationship deepened into something unusual, and, to many, deeply puzzling. Wexner was known as a shrewd businessman, a man who guarded his fortune carefully. Yet, for reasons never fully explained, he handed over almost unprecedented financial control to Epstein. Through a power of attorney agreement, Epstein gained authority to sign checks on Wexner's behalf, manage his assets, buy and sell property, and even borrow money in his name. This level of trust was extraordinary. Few billionaires would hand that much power to anyone, let alone to someone without a traditional financial pedigree. What exactly Epstein did for Wexner remains a mystery. Some say Epstein was a financial wizard who found ways to grow Wexner's already massive fortune. Others suspect Epstein used his charm and manipulative personality to gain Wexner's confidence, gradually tightening his control. What's clear is that Wexner's backing allowed Epstein to live a life of luxury on a scale he had never imagined. The Manhattan townhouse. One of Epstein's most infamous properties came directly through Wexner. The 7-story mansion on East 71st Street in Manhattan was once Wexner's home. By the 1990s, it had effectively become Epstein's base of operations. The townhouse was massive, more than 50,000 square feet, and decorated in Epstein's unsettling style. Visitors later described bizarre artwork, including a massive portrait of Bill Clinton in a blue dress and red heels, mannequins, taxidermy animals, and other disturbing decor. The home reportedly contained hidden security cameras, raising questions about whether Epstein used surveillance as a tool to gain leverage over his powerful guests. This townhouse became a stage for Epstein's double life: glamorous dinners with celebrities, scientists, and world leaders on one floor, and, as survivors later testified, exploitation of young women on another. Other properties and expansion. With Wexner's support, Epstein expanded his empire of homes, the Palm Beach Mansion, where many survivors said they were first lured into his network. Little St. James, the private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where Epstein had absolute control over who came and went. Zorro Ranch in New Mexico, an enormous estate with its own airstrip, further isolating survivors from the outside world. A Paris apartment, giving him access to the European elite. These properties weren't just homes, they were stages for his manipulation system. Survivors described how Epstein used his wealth to impress, lure, and then entrap them. Luxury was the bait. The reality was something far darker. The growing influence. Through Wexner's backing, Epstein cultivated a social network that read like a guest list from a royal gala. He was photographed with U.S. presidents, British royalty, Nobel Prize winners, and Hollywood celebrities. He wasn't just rich, he seemed to know everyone. And more importantly, he seemed to have influence that extended into the highest levels of society. Whether through money, secrets, or sheer audacity, Epstein positioned himself as untouchable. But at the heart of his empire was the illusion that his wealth was built solely on financial genius. In reality, much of his power came from secrecy, manipulation, and the people around him. None more important than Ghislaine Maxwell, who would soon become his partner in both life and crime. By the early 1990s, Jeffrey Epstein's wealth and influence had reached staggering levels. He had multiple homes, private jets, and access to some of the most powerful people in the world. On the surface, he presented himself as a sophisticated financier and philanthropist. But behind closed doors, Epstein was running what survivors would later describe as a carefully constructed manipulation network. This system was designed to lure young women into his orbit, trap them through promises and intimidation, and keep the cycle going indefinitely. The modeling agency connection. One of Epstein's most effective tactics was his connection to the fashion world. He courted modeling agencies and industry insiders, presenting himself as a man who could make careers happen. Survivors later recalled being told things like, "You've got the look. I know people at modeling agencies. I can get you in." For young girls, some barely out of middle school, the lure of modeling was powerful. It wasn't just about money. It was about the dream of glamour, independence, and recognition. Epstein and his associates dangled that dream like bait. But once the girls stepped into his world, the promises vanished. Survivors described being taken to Epstein's properties under the pretense of interviews or portfolio opportunities, only to be pressured into situations of S.A. Ghislaine Maxwell, the enabler. Standing beside Epstein was Ghislaine Maxwell, daughter of the disgraced British media mogul Robert Maxwell. After her father's mysterious death in 1991, Ghislaine relocated to New York, where she quickly became Epstein's constant companion. Maxwell played a critical role in recruitment. Survivors testified that she acted as a gatekeeper, the one who made initial contact, gained trust, and smoothed over doubts. In New York City, witnesses recalled Maxwell literally pulling her car over on the street to approach young girls. She would strike up casual conversations, asking about their schools, their dreams, their interests. She often mentioned opportunities: modeling, education, scholarships. Coming from a polished, well-dressed British socialite, these offers seemed legitimate. This tactic wasn't limited to New York. Survivors across the globe, in London, Paris, Florida, and beyond, described Maxwell's presence in recruitment. She was the friendly face, the reassurance, the person who made Epstein's world seem glamorous instead of dangerous. Many survivors later said they initially trusted Epstein because Maxwell was there. The presence of another woman, someone confident and worldly, gave them a false sense of safety. The routine. The process of recruitment followed a disturbing, almost mechanical pattern. Survivors described it in chillingly similar ways. Initial approach: A recruiter, sometimes Maxwell herself, would make contact. Other times, girls were introduced by friends who had already been pulled into the system. The promise: offers of money, modeling, tutoring, or financial help with school. The bait varied, but the goal was always the same: to get them through Epstein's doors. The first visit. Survivors were often invited to one of Epstein's homes. They described being dazzled by the luxury. Marble floors, priceless art, sprawling rooms. Some were offered cash immediately, creating a sense of obligation. The massage. Almost every survivor's story included this step. They were told Epstein liked massages. At first, it seemed harmless, easy money. But once behind closed doors, the situation escalated into the cycle. After the first encounter, Epstein used a mix of gifts, money, and threats to keep survivors returning. Some were given hundreds of dollars. Others received tuition payments or promises of career connections. For those who resisted, intimidation kept them silent. This system was highly organized. Survivors said Maxwell and other assistants scheduled appointments, arranged travel, and managed the flow of girls through Epstein's homes. It was, in many ways, a conveyor belt of exploitation. The properties as stages. Each of Epstein's properties played a role in his system. Palm Beach Mansion. Survivors described being led upstairs into massage rooms. Police later found a massage table, oils, and other evidence consistent with survivor testimony. Manhattan Townhouse. Staff recalled constant visitors, often much younger women. The home was filled with cameras, raising speculation that Epstein may have collected compromising material on guests. Little St. James Island. Survivors said this was the most isolating. With no outsiders and no easy way off, the island became a place where Epstein exercised complete control. Zorro Ranch in New Mexico. Vast and secluded, it allowed Epstein to isolate survivors under the guise of weekend getaways. Each property reinforced the same cycle: lure, impress, entrap, control. The web of silence. Despite the whispers, Epstein remained untouchable throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. His connections shielded him. His wealth silenced those who might have spoken out. And the survivors, young and often without resources, felt powerless against him. But by 2005, the cycle of silence would finally begin to crack in Palm Beach, Florida, where parents reported him to the police, setting in motion the first real attempt to hold Epstein accountable. By 2005, Jeffrey Epstein's system of control had been running quietly for years. But in Palm Beach, Florida, the cycle of silence finally began to break. It started when the parents of a 14-year-old girl contacted the Palm Beach Police Department. Their daughter had confided that she had been lured to Epstein's mansion under the pretense of making money and had instead been subjected to SA. The parents were outraged and demanded an investigation. For the Palm Beach police, this wasn't just a complaint. It was the first crack in a carefully guarded empire. Detectives begin digging. The case was assigned to Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Ryder and Detective Joe Riccieri. From the beginning, they knew they were up against someone powerful. Epstein wasn't just another suspect. He was a wealthy financier with connections to politicians, billionaires, and celebrities. But the detectives pressed forward. They began interviewing the girl and quickly discovered a pattern. The girl's story was detailed and specific. She described the layout of Epstein's mansion, the routines, and the massage that turned into coercion. Encouraged by her testimony, detectives sought out others. What they found shocked even seasoned investigators. The survivor accounts. One by one, more young women came forward. Many were between the ages of 14 and 17. Their stories followed the same pattern. They were approached by a friend or acquaintance who told them they could make easy money giving Epstein a massage. Once inside the mansion, they were led upstairs to a room equipped with a massage table, oils, and dim lighting. Epstein would enter wearing only a towel or nothing at all. What began as a massage quickly escalated into SA. Afterward, they were paid, usually a few $100s in cash. Some were told to recruit their friends, ensuring a steady stream of new victims. The consistency was undeniable. Each survivor described the mansion's interior in detail. They identified the same furniture, the same layout, the same unsettling rituals. As detectives dug deeper, they realized they weren't dealing with a single case, but with a pattern of systemic exploitation. Survivors later said there may have been dozens, even hundreds of girls caught in Epstein's cycle. Building the case, police began surveilling Epstein's Palm Beach mansion. They noted the constant flow of young women arriving and leaving. They interviewed staff who quietly confirmed suspicions. One house manager described keeping records of the guests, records that would later become crucial evidence. By 2006, Palm Beach police had built a substantial case file. It included survivor testimony, physical evidence from the mansion, including the massage table, records of payments, statements from staff. It was the kind of case that, under normal circumstances, would have led to multiple charges and likely a lengthy prison sentence. The pushback. But Epstein was no ordinary suspect. As soon as he caught wind of the investigation, he mobilized his legal team. And this wasn't just any defense team. It included some of the most powerful attorneys in America. Alan Dershowitz, a Harvard law professor and celebrity lawyer. Ken Starr, the former special prosecutor known for investigating President Bill Clinton. Roy Black, a high-profile defense attorney. This dream team launched an aggressive counterattack. They questioned the credibility of survivors, scrutinized their backgrounds, and pressured officials at every turn. Behind the scenes, they used Epstein's influence to lobby prosecutors and sway decision-makers. What should have been a straightforward criminal case was suddenly bogged down by politics and legal maneuvering. State versus federal. The Palm Beach Police Department recommended multiple felony charges, including unlawful SA with minors. But when the case reached the desk of state prosecutors, something strange happened. Instead of moving forward aggressively, they hesitated. Chief Reiter, frustrated by what he saw as a lack of action, did something unusual. He handed the case to the FBI. If state prosecutors wouldn't pursue justice, maybe federal ones would. The FBI opened a federal investigation in 2006, and what they found confirmed police suspicions. Epstein wasn't just a wealthy man with a few bad habits. He was running a large-scale exploitation system, using his homes, his assistants, and his influence to keep it going. Dozens of survivors were identified. Some were even flown across state lines, adding potential federal charges. The evidence was piling up. It seemed Epstein's downfall was imminent. But instead of facing federal prison, Epstein would cut one of the most controversial deals in modern history. A deal that left survivors outraged and allowed him to walk free after barely a year behind bars. If you want to keep hearing the stories that matter, please like, comment, and subscribe. Together, we can keep giving a voice to those who have been silenced. By 2007, federal prosecutors in Florida had a strong case against Jeffrey Epstein. The FBI had identified dozens of survivors. The evidence showed a clear, disturbing pattern. Young women recruited, lured into Epstein's homes, and then trapped in cycles of SA. On paper, Epstein was facing charges that could have landed him in prison for decades. Survivors and investigators alike braced for what seemed like the inevitable, a high-profile trial that would finally expose his crimes. But what happened instead would go down as one of the most shocking legal agreements in modern American history. The non-prosecution agreement, behind closed doors, Epstein's legal team began negotiating with federal prosecutors. His lawyers were some of the most powerful in the country. Alan Dershowitz, Ken Starr, Roy Black, and Jay Lefkowitz among them. Their combined influence was immense. In 2008, prosecutors led by Alexander Acosta, then U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Florida, struck a non-prosecution agreement with Epstein. Under this secret deal, federal charges were dropped. Instead, Epstein agreed to plead guilty to two lesser state charges: solicitation of a minor, solicitation of prostitution. For crimes that had devastated dozens of young women, this outcome was almost unthinkable. The sentence: Epstein was sentenced to 18 months in the Palm Beach County Jail. Even that sentence was softened. He served only 13 months. He was granted work release, which allowed him to leave the jail for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. During this time, he worked out of a private office, continuing to manage his affairs as if little had changed. Survivors were stunned. They had come forward, shared painful details, and trusted the system to deliver justice. Instead, they watched as Epstein returned to his life of wealth and privilege after barely a year behind bars. The secrecy and illegality. What made the deal even more disturbing was how it was handled. Survivors later said they were never informed about the agreement. Federal law, specifically the Crime Victims' Rights Act, requires that victims be notified about plea deals. In this case, they were kept entirely in the dark. Years later, a federal judge would rule that the plea agreement had violated the law. But by then, the damage was done. Epstein had walked free. Alexander Acosta's role. When the plea deal came to light years later, much of the scrutiny fell on Alexander Acosta. Critics demanded answers. Why had he signed off on such a lenient agreement? Acosta defended himself by saying it was the best deal prosecutors could get at the time, given the challenges of the case. But in one closed-door meeting, he reportedly told officials that Epstein belonged to intelligence. That cryptic remark fueled endless speculation that Epstein's connections extended far deeper than anyone imagined. Acosta would later become U.S. Secretary of Labor under President Donald Trump. But when Epstein was arrested again in 2019, outrage over the 2008 deal resurfaced, and Acosta resigned in disgrace. The aftermath. By the end of 2009, Epstein was a free man once more. He returned to his Palm Beach mansion, his Manhattan townhouse, and his private island. His reputation was tarnished but not destroyed. Some associates distanced themselves, but many, disturbingly, continued to associate with him. For the survivors, the plea deal was a devastating betrayal. They had trusted the justice system to protect them. Instead, they had been sidelined, silenced, and ignored. Epstein had escaped with what amounted to a slap on the wrist. It seemed like he was untouchable. If you want to keep hearing the stories that matter, please like, comment, and subscribe. Together, we can keep giving a voice to those who have been silenced. Stay tuned for Part 2, The Undoing of a Monster.